the valley itself was perfect for a reservoir, for better or for worse. There's very good granite, solid, steep-hilled valley with 3 rivers coming in and only really 2 spots where they would have to either create a dam or a dike. And so as Boston grew, it was an obvious choice.
Yeah.
They had talked about actually bringing water all the way from Winnipesaukee down to Boston at one point. Talk about an engineering project.
Yeah, yeah. And it says so much about the claims of that a city and that an urban center can lay, or can exert the power that an urban center can exert on areas like this valley and the people who live there. Even though they might have heard, whispers of rumors of something that might be coming, I got the sense that that when it did begin to happen, it was met with a sort of the feeling of inevitability and powerlessness, that there's nothing we can do. And in fact, I seem to remember reading that some of the city fathers in Boston, or some of the architects of this project, relied on the ignorance of those provincial folk, and knew that if they kept the business, kept the energies at work in Boston and not out there, that they could just pass it through pretty easily.
Well, and there's the practical issue of the fact that it would have taken a day, perhaps more, for a farmer to go into Boston just to get there.
Right.
Would have taken a day at that. This is obviously pre highways, so fighting it was really not an option for most of them.
Right. The coincidence of the clearing of the valley, the disestablishment of the towns, disincorporation, of the towns, the removal of the bodies, living and dead, and the gradual filling of the reservoir, the way that coincided with what was happening on a larger national and even international scale, and that there were massive upheavals at work globally that were in sync in some ways, or at least were rhyming with the massive upheavals that were happening in that valley.
I think that's a great word for it, rhyming. I mean, you think about what was happening in the Highlands of Scotland in the 18th century, what's happening with the Irish in the 19th century, what's happening there's a Spanish town in the Franco area of 40s and 50s which had a very similar experience to this in terms of reservoirs. Three Gorges Dam in China is a much larger scale, but very much within our time frame. Mm-hmm. But these moments when something is needed by a city, a state, and the needs of those in an urban place or in a place of power outweighs the people who are living in the place.
Right. And so there's really no recourse but to go under. And I think you were asking earlier about the genesis of that poem, Atlantis.
Yes.
And when I don't quite remember the moment that it came to me, but I do remember trying to capture something of the feeling of helplessness and going under a force that was much larger than yourself, oceanic, and it could be political or some other atmospheric pressure out there. But I think a line in the poem is tapestries unraveling into war. The time that poem was written, our country was unraveling into the first of the wars in Iraq, and the sense of being under that great weight and yet the mind being a voyage hungering to happen, but being stifled and stymied somehow.
In that sort of Ithaca sort of way, that sort of the journey. In that sense, in an almost mythological, classical way?
I think it probably has, but maybe I was thinking of Blake's Mental Traveler. That the body is paralyzed under a great weight, and yet the mind is set on voyaging despite of physical of being physically stifled.
Do you see, and I want to read a passage out of another work of yours, which also works with this image of water, water as this sort of unreal covering stuff. And while I'm getting that, can you talk a little bit about what water means to you, either as a person or as a creative person?
Yeah, well, I think water is a great generative force, along with sunlight, and it's been compared to the soul and to the journey of the soul. And in this poem on Quabbin, the poem itself begins with water as an originating source that eventually will return unto itself after going through massive changes and migrations. And I suppose that's the soul connection, the transmigrations and shape-shifting quality of water, and the shape-shifting quality of the creative process, I guess is how I see it important to me. But as an image in particular works, there's Atlantis, where a whole civilization has been swallowed. And in the work that I think you're pulling up here, there is this sense of being able to glide out over the surface of water and stare down into it, into a time or through a time where where time has ceased to exist.
It's sort of a freezing. It's a way of freezing, like an anoxic sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wonder what before I knew that the towns under Quabbin had been dismantled and everything had been moved out, I imagined, what would it be to float out on one of those glass-bottom boats and you could peer down into a landscape, townscape that hadn't been changed very much at all, and you could imagine the people still down there going about their business as if nothing had changed.
And I think this is one of the you talk to people from the area and you talk to their children in particular, because there aren't that many left who are actually living there. And there's this sense that there are a lot of different silver linings to this situation, and one of them is that the surrounding towns are susceptible to things like mini malls and traffic lights and pollution and noise, and in one quite literal way, the Quabbin is one of the biggest outdoor road-free, human-free areas in southern New England for certain. And it's sort of frozen in that way, but also their homestead, their sense of home is also frozen. It can't be sullied.
Yeah,
it
I
can't be
remember
polluted or raised in any way because it's frozen in time.
Yeah, I remember a man in some of the material we were reading talking about his childhood lives on. It can't be spoiled in memory, right? It's there, preserved under the water, under the waves, which of course it's not. But it's a human. Yeah. It's a human feeling or human desire, right? To wishful thinking that something hasn't been lost, even though the losses were catastrophic for the people who lived there.
So I want to read this passage, and before I do, I want to ask you, so this is from Crows in Eden, a work that I think came between Atlantis and the other Unbodyings texts? Okay. Yeah. So these are the words of an old man. I liken our condition to a town I read about but haven't ever seen, flooded in the 50s when they built the dam beneath it. I forget the name of the lake and town, but you can take a boat across it now, and looking down still see the town intact, the streets and square, the shops and yards and houses with their white imagined picket fences, flocks of kids, housewives, pinning linens on the lines, late afternoons, the fathers coming home, stepping out with the ubiquitous martini, all 50 feet below you, captured in a time which isn't time, but water, as ours resembles air. And there are a couple of lines in there which are really, to my ear, coming very close to the Unbodyings text. Mm-hmm. They're really, really close. And how much was Quabbin on your mind? Did you know about Quabbin when you wrote this?
I don't think I knew much about Quabbin at that time, and I don't think that you and I had talked about this project. But I think that that these lines bear testimony to why Quabbin as a subject would be so magnetic to me, because it's very much the condition that's being described in those lines, and that scape that you just read pertains to a community that is submerged in denial, in a denial of history. Horrible things had taken place that parts of the population decided to shove out of consciousness, and that shoving out created the condition of submersion in ignorance, willful ignorance. And so that's another way that water as a symbol, as an image, but as a symbol can suggest so many different shapes of thought and condition.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and for me, water as a musician is something that suggests certain fluid gestures and certain sort of cascades of sound. In the first part of the piece, I'm looking at almost this avalanche of cultural references. You've given me references from French, from Celtic, from Latin, from really all of European and other cultures, and they come at you in this cacophony, or and so that was wonderful to work with, and to have just this almost spray of references to try and weave into music.
Well, that was a question I had for you. It has to do with the process of translation of words and the ideas that are embedded in words into sound, musical sound, and the ideas and the grammar and the syntax of music. And if we want to talk about that opening piece, maybe we could, because it's not only a cascade of cultural references, but also I tried very, consciously to provide you with a cascade of sound, of consonantal and vowel music. Really tried to go overboard, in the onomatopoetics of that opening section, to suggest the potency and shape-shiftingness, the shape-shifting quality of water. But so how was it for you to move that into music?
Oh, it was really a joy. It was it came really naturally. And one of the things that I did was I took the words, especially words like sempiternal, and you can break that into not just etymological roots, but you can also break it into sounds. Sem. There's something evocative of water in certainly the s and the and I could heighten that by creating these moments where it's just sa, and that almost first sound. If we think about sort of proto-language, that first sound, the and I was able to break apart the words in ways that suggest this Ursprache that you reference in the poem. And also, it sounds like water. It's there are moments where you talk about wren trickle, and the trickle is, it's a great word to describe what wrens do, but also it's a moment where I can take apart the word and go, gl. I can really focus on the things that I can ripple through the word. Right. I have the choir sing k at different places and close to the L, so it goes k, and it sort of evokes the sound of the bird. The aria of Orioles, again, Orioles, there's something very singing about the words themselves, which to me leapt off the page.
And that's, I think, what onomatopoeia is trying to do, is to close the gap between the word and the world, right? To again, back to rhyme, so that language rhymes with being or material existence. And so so you're trying in the music to capture that relation.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was thinking about when I got sort of half to 2/3 of the way through realizing that first section was, this is making me seasick. Like, it was just things were moving and nothing was sort of staying still in this way that even though there were there's a middle C that's sounding through much of that, but the music is sort of dipping below and coming over both melodically and sort of harmonically. There's moments where it just can't quite settle down.
Yep.
It's almost like it's bobbing on the waves or something.
Yeah.
That was kind of an interesting moment when I realized that this should make you feel a little seasick. You should feel a little disoriented. There is something disorienting about being in a place and having someone else's culture come over you, and whether that's being from Western Mass and having the culture of Boston come over you, or whether that means being a Native American and having a European culture come over you. Or any number of other places in the world.
Or an animal culture having a human culture come over you, or a natural landscape having a glacier come over you.
And this is one of the things that we talked about. You just reminded me sort of this idea that when we're talking about diaspora, because that's the sort of larger project that this is part of, several concerts. Diaspora, to me, I was trying to reduce it to something very simple, and that simple idea was populations in motion. And that starts to talk about, you can break that apart in a bunch of different ways. What is a population? Is that only humans? Well, could be humans, could be animal, could actually be elemental. It could be, water. Water itself is its natural course through the valley is being dammed and changed. The water cycle, its migration through the climate is changed, and so it sort of creates its own ideas of what does it mean to be water at home. What does that mean? I'm not sure, but that's certainly a question. Bigger questions of wildlife management. This is an area that has made it possible for a lot of species to rebound, in part. Bald eagle, the coyotes, the deer. In fact, there were so many deer they had to open it up to a cull. And many other species, migratory birds, certainly come through in great numbers. And so taking the humans out and creating this area which was protected for the quality of water for Boston has had as this sort of side benefit that animals have come back. And I'm there all the time. It's an amazing place, and I've taken you there at least twice.
And it's funny, since we started this project and we tell people what we're doing, so many people have said, "Oh, the Quabbin, it's a magical place," and even reminiscent of their own youth or their college days out in Western Mass. And it's a sacred place to a lot of people.
Yeah, and the other side of that is that there are a lot of people in Boston who drink the water of Quabbin and have no idea.
Unwittingly, yeah.
No idea that it exists.
That was me for close to 10 years living in Boston, right there on the Chestnut Hill Reservoir that is one of the destinations of those subterranean pipes coming in from Western Mass. Used to, that was my water supply. Little did I know, 15, close to 20 years later, I would be writing a piece about this.
Yeah. So after this first movement, which is all these cultural references, this sense of avalanche or drowning, we come to the second movement, which is very intimate and personal and calm. And maybe you can talk about a little bit dramatically of what you were thinking in terms of balancing the first, because the first movement is full of sound, and the second movement is perhaps languid.
Yeah, well, I think that the first movement in that cacophonous cascading that you described, and the flood and avalanche of plurality of cultures and sound and all of that. The final line of that first section is surfacing into the world of time. And that word time felt like the chiming or the tolling of a bell to me, that then opens us into the second section called The Valley of Lost Names, which the feeling there is more elegiac. And instead of the rippling down of water, suddenly we have a placid surface, below which are the drowned towns, or where they used to be, and all of the names that have been lost. And so, I think that the movement there is into something that feels like elegy, not quite dirge, it's not quite that heavy, and the lines are longer, and just structurally the way it's laid out on the page, I think there's more room to breathe. It's not this tongue-tripping, headlong energy falling forward. It's more staid and layered.
Yeah, and when I was looking at it, when I was reading it as sort of an epic. The first section is just epic. It's on a grander scale than humans.
Right.
It's across time, across cultures, and the second is very intimate. It's very much about individual people. We talk about the veins in the hand. We talk about waving at one another. These very simple human gestures on a. We talk about the dew in the morning on the lilacs. We talk about these very, very personal things. And I tried to reflect that a little bit through the music. Certainly the lines lend themselves to a more lyrical treatment. Harmonically, it's much more stable.
Yeah. And is this the part in your score where Isaac Watts begins to come in?
No, that's in the first movement.
That's okay, because that was a question that I had too, that decision to bring that block of culture and musical history into this. What were you thinking?
Well, okay. So in the first movement, there's a chunk of Jeremiah Ingles' tune with Isaac Watts' text. So Isaac Watts, English hymn writer. Jeremiah Ingles is local to Western Massachusetts and Vermont, shape note tune writer. Yeah. And there were a number of things I liked about the tune. The tune has this wonderful moment where there's a C against a C sharp in a treatment which is really striking. And one of the things that I try and talk about through music in the piece is this idea of displacement, things being sort of either in this, taken out of place, and that striking moment of dissonance, a very unexpected dissonance, and also them sort of sharing the same note name. And C, the note C, middle C, is really important to the first movement. So having this moment where there's C sharp just smashing into it and trying to sort of co-opt or coexist in some way was something that really drew me to that. The text, the Isaac Watts text, which I used, talks about there's some images of water and clouds sort of seeing across to Canaan, this idea of promised land, again, this idea of home, and the promise of a place to belong. And also there's this wonderful line, which comes back in the last movement. I also quote it in the last movement, unbeclouded eyes. And, clouds being, a form of water, but also, indicative of tears here through metaphor, another form of water, and to see it with clear eyes. And in this context, how interesting that is to think about what it means to see something through clear eyes. To see Canaan, a word in and of itself, which the etymology we're not clear on, but it may mean low place or valley, which I found when I found that out after sort of looking at the text. That was another thing that really drew me to it.
Yeah. And of course, diaspora is implicit in that the journey, wandering through wilderness to find to land in a land of promise, crossing over a river in order to find that. And also, the Puritan tradition that Watts comes out of is so ingrained to the locale of Massachusetts. And so that's one of the things that I thought was so apt about your using that hymn, and that hymn, but hymn in general, and also shape note singing. I appreciated those blocks of, I'll say Indigenous culture, although it depends on where you're plugging into culture as to what's Indigenous or not. But it's certainly, Boston was a promised land to many people who were
the city on the hill,
who were diaspora. The city on a hill, which our piece references in the end. With the twist that perhaps someday that city on a hill will itself be at the bottom of a seafloor, which as a physical fact resonates, but also as a symbol can resonate, because if you think of what city on a hill, how that was originally invoked as a beacon of religious tolerance or freedom or whatever it was that was being evoked in that phrase by Winthrop, right? When he used it, and it was used later on, by Kennedy in a speech for I can't remember in Congress.
And Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes.
So it shows up different places, but as a figurative city on a hill. And so when you think of that as sunken to forming a seafloor, part of a seafloor, and you sort of wonder where culturally we might be at that time.
And the other thing about that Isaac Watts and Ingles interpolation is again sort of this cascade of cultural references. I wanted to bring in something that was even more sort of a chunk. One of the things that we find throughout New England are these glacial erratics, these giant boulders that were picked up in Quebec and brought hundreds of miles and just dropped when the glaciers melted. And I love the idea of just finding this big chunk of something else in the middle of music.
I love the word erratics, which we were able to use in this piece. I don't think it's too commonly known that that's a word describing glacial drift. You know, we think of it as a sort of human quality.
He's an erratic.
Yeah. But see, I mean, I love that human history deposits erratics everywhere too, which gets back to that idea of diaspora.
Oh, absolutely.
And the way that erratic resembles errant, and wandering stars.
Oh, that's a great image of these.
You know, that to be erratic is to be errant and to be.
And you certainly find pockets of cultures in other cities. You know, you find a pocket of Portuguese folks around.
Oh yeah.
Rhode Island.
And so New England,
Yeah.
Massachusetts, if we're talking about that, it's populated with erratics on so many levels.
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. Yeah, definitely.
You know, I know many of them. I am one. I am one. I mean, and you're probably a little more native, but more or less, but I'm certainly not. I was deposited here by a great glacier that, was called Graduate School. That left me here in 1993, and I've never left since. I'm, ossified, petrified, not going anywhere. But, when I lived in Boston, you never met anybody from Boston. I didn't, everybody we knew was in transit. And so that feels like, I know it wouldn't feel universally so, but it feels, at least in sort of the worlds that you and I travel in, it feels like a common condition of people who whose lives are a little uprooted, deracinated, and who drift about and find themselves deposited by larger forces.
I want to change tack just for a second. There's a question that's been sort of percolating in my mind, and that is sort of this notion of documentary versus not. How strict. When we started this, we talked a little bit about sort of the amount of documentariness, because we could have told this as a very, very true story about a specific person. There are a lot of wonderful stories that are preserved through oral tradition and written down in a number of collections. And I know you enjoyed a bunch of them. I enjoyed as many as I can get my hands on too. And were you ever tempted to tell a very specific story, or?
Well, I was interested in knowing what the story was, but the fact that it had already been told so many times in different ways, not just in books but in film and documentaries, at least one on, and in photographs and museums and monograph after monograph. And so that, in a way, liberated me to think about, fictional truth. Using the facts as a means to get towards some. It's not so much a deeper truth; it's just a different truth that reflects the local condition of Quabbin. Reflects that in larger spheres of experience.
So it's almost thinking in terms of an iconic story.
Yeah.
And not getting bogged down on the details of one specific telling.
Right, we weren't writing a history. We're trying to create a work of art that will speak on many levels. And of course, it helps if you know something about Quabbin, and of course it helped us to be able to reference Quabbin in that locale, instead of having to recreate some fictional world. But because we're working in a multi-layered work of art, we can bring Quabbin up against Atlantis, and without any fear or anxiety of historical trespass. We can suggest analogs between this particular experience and other places, and we can do things that history can't do. Like we can imagine the experience of those ghosts that are still down there under the surface, or we can imagine the water flowing out of Quabbin through those subterranean pipes 65 miles east to Boston. We can imagine them as infernal souls, as shades that are traveling into this metropolis that will, like Lucifer at the heart, that will consume them at its core. That's a little high blown, but that's not exactly how we imagined it. But we're free to if we want to, right? Because poetry, art, and music, and just the language of music can do so many things that straight history can't do. you know, that verbal language won't or can't do. You know.
I love this idea of the iconic, thinking about it in terms of something that someone who knows a similar story, it gives them a way of getting into it. It gives them an opening to sort of insert their own journey into the journey.
Yeah.
In a way that something purely objective is a lot harder to do.
Yeah. And I think that in this piece we tried to, at various points, we tried to move close to history. You know, the first movement is very much out of time. That's why when it surfaces into the world of time, then we're in a particular valley, you know, the Valley of Lost Names. It might not have a name, or the names might have been lost. But as you said earlier, there are the vestiges of those who had inhabited historically that land, you know, that valley. And I think that in the third section, which is questions for a disincorporation, I mean, we actually have 4 names of the towns listed.
Yeah.
You know, so and then the final word of the whole sequence is Boston. Yeah. And so, you know, it moves in the direction of history and actuality, but within that movement, there's a lot of license and leeway for talking about things like, you know, Yggdrasils and Ursprachas and Ouroboros and, you know, things that lie way outside the Swift River Valley.
So this word disincorporation, which is such sort of Latinate.
Oh, it's a horrible word.
Ridiculousness. And I want to ask you about the first time you heard that word. I mean, the bits and pieces are not hard to pull apart. Yeah. But what did you think when you heard disincorporation?
It's an assault on sensibilities. You know, one of those words that are functionally correct, you know, and bureaucratic. And so disincorporation, you know, well, the town had to be incorporated first, which, you know, and I love the presence of the body in there at the court, the bringing it into corporality.
Yeah, right. To bring it to create a body out of something that is disparate.
So it's been embodied. And I think that we wanted to inflict a similar sort of violence on language in our title, which takes the word unbodyings and, you know, chops it with slashes. And so in a way, our title, I think, is a talk back to disincorporation.
I mean, in some ways, it's a translation.
Yeah.
But by chopping it up, we allow people to sort of looking at bodying.
You're right.
Unbodyings. What bodies are we talking about?
Right. And we were able to bring in the sense of verb as well as noun. So it's not just the body, but it brings in to body something forth. Which is Shakespeare too, right? And as imagination bodies forth, ... and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And I thought that we were doing something similar there. We were giving this body of water and sort of the experience of the people who had, and things, creatures who had been there, we were giving it a local habitation and a name by bodying forth, you know, something of our reaction to or feelings about the place.
And there's you know, also the quite literal reference of the fact that the bodies were taken.
Exactly.
You know, there were more bodies exhumed and reinterred than there were people alive. It was something like 2,500 people who were displaced, but there were almost 7,500 graves that had to be accounted for, removed, and reinterred elsewhere.
And the violence implicit in that process of, you know, chopping up, not chopping up the body, but there were remains that you were, and in many cases, you know, graves that were going back to the 17th century.
A button.
Yeah, what are you picking out and transporting, carting off, again, to a hill, to higher ground. The new Quabbin Park Cemetery that you and I have spent time in.
And I've been able to track down, so I have some photographs of the Enfield Cemetery from around 1910, and some of the graves are identifiable, and I've been able to re-identify them. Now, of course, they're no longer next to one another, and this is one of the things that happened, is that they were not able to entirely keep even those groups of people all together, and
so the communities, as represented by the grave arrangements, have been embodied as well.
It's a beautiful space, though.
Yeah, but it's haunting because generally you think of, you know, a cemetery or a graveyard as the, you know, the final home, and you have a strong sense when you're there that this was not the original place of interment, that this has been manufactured for the occasion, and rightfully so. But
and beautifully so.
It does not have the feeling of settlement that you have in other cemeteries.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that there are monuments, important monuments from the original towns, sometimes from the cemeteries, sometimes from the town common, that have been moved and placed side by side. So you have, you know, a Civil War monument from one town next to a Revolutionary War monument from another town, and so they've created this place. It's almost like a museum of the cemeteries. It's interesting place. I love going there. It's a wonderful place to be. But you're right. It has this very interesting quality, and that idea of final resting place being disrupted is really
you know, which in many cultures has been taboo, and it was allowed by this. You know, it was enforced by the state in this case, and that's another thing. You know, just one of the facts of you know, displacement is haunting enough, and, you know, disincorporation and the whole valley being razed to nothing, not a tree, not a shrub left in order to create that. All of that's disturbing, but the graves is one little piece of the whole picture that is quite unsettling. That, you know, even, well, I mean, they weren't going to leave them there, right? You couldn't do that, and so the part of the process was that the bodies had to be, you know, disinterred, carted up the hill, and replanted. Is disturbing.
Yeah, you know, thinking about all the things that were covered up, one of the things that really struck me in thinking about this, looking at the big maps, there's a wonderful planning map from the 20s, and you realize that not only are the towns and the railroads and the cemeteries and everything but the ponds and the rivers are being covered up. And so, in a sense, there's still a pond at the bottom of the reservoir. And that idea, for whatever reason, really resonated with me.
Me too. And they you know, they've set divers down there, and the divers can swim along the riverbed, and they know it's the riverbed because you have lines of trash, you know, from before the river was flooded. You know, the towns would dump into the river, and so they can follow the old riverbeds, and you know, the fish are down there, the big mouth, largemouth bass, and the salmon even are down there, and that to me was so psychically resonant. You know, it's like the fish are down there cantering about where the horses were, and it's as though they're sort of angels floating through the atmosphere of this water that now, and that gets back to what you read from Crows and Eden. The water now has the viscosity of what, or it is viscous in a way that before the water it was just air, you know, that people were moving through, and now we're moving through water, and all of that, you know, both air and the water, it's all analogous to time and moving through the medium of time, which gets us back to music and the way that you move us through time in this piece.
And that was one thing that I knew early on I wanted to play with. You know, one of the big ideas of diaspora is displacement, and I wanted to play with displacement. You know, both melodically. The first gestures are very small gestures of displacement, but also in terms of time. And there are several moments in the piece where the choir is not singing together. That the sense of beat, pulse, taktus, is fractured, and the choir is allowed to sort of migrate temporally away from that sense of cohesion, which is something I always really wanted to do, and I think in the right place and in the right measure, it can be very effective. And at the end, in the fourth movement, there's a spot where the choir really gets way out and then comes back in time together. It's in fact during the quotation of the Isaac Watts that hymn verse, this idea of seeing things with unbeclouded eyes, that there is the promise of a moment of clarity, a moment of seeing the promised land, some idea of home, to see it. Musically, I was able to do it in such a way that you get that moment of seeing it clearly, but then you go back to this elegiac sort of mode.
Mm-hmm.
And that moment of clarity does not last. It's fleeting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the other things, I mean, so just talking about displacement in other terms, I love the idea of this. So on the last night of before the disincorporation, they had a ball, a gala dance with a dance band, and people came from all around. And I love this moment in your poem where it sort of comes into being as a vision out of these swans. They become dancers, and all of a sudden we're transported back to this place. And I sort of try to evoke that through music that is reminiscent of dance band music of that era, 20s, 30s. But also through this evocation of a record player that skips, something stuck, or the film kind of gets unspooled a little bit. And when you think about a record player, that when the needle skips, it's a displacement. It's both a physical displacement, but also in terms of understanding music, it's a temporal displacement. And by doing that, it was a way of going there, but going there in a way that recognizes that it's a leap.
Yeah, and I think that mirrors what's happening in the text, because as I recall it, it's looking off across the water to the tops of trees, far away, distant. Actually, this is from the lookout, looking down on what used to be Enfield and that very hall, which is where that final dance happened. But looking across a great distance at the trees that are bending and swaying in the wind. That's the primary image that then in imagination moves to the bending necks of swans, that then moving in consort, which then moves into an imagined group of people who are dancing just where you're looking, right? You're looking where it happened, and yet the people are coming to you through the filter of trees / swans, and then they appear. But even they are held at another room because they're on a silent film, and so that's that sense of temporal disjunction. When you watch a silent film from the 20s or the 30s, you're gazing over a vast period of time, and you're seeing something quite artificial and held at a vast removed black and white film. That's not life. That's something very different.
And it's not uncommon for a silent film to have music added well after the fact. And so disjunction between the audio track and the video track.
And I think that maybe that was playing in my thinking too, when in writing about the couples who are dancing in time as in a silent film. Something in me must have known that eventually this would be in music. That there would be music accompanying their dancing in that moment, written by you. I couldn't know what the music was going to be, but it was, and that was another experience that there's a lot that we have talked about and could talk about, of just the process of collaboration and writing with the knowledge that this is going to be moved into music, and from your end, working with words that have consciously been penned with the aim of, and yet what I gave you was just part of the whole project. It was maybe half if we want to divide it up like that. But here was this, and in order for it to find its fulfillment, you're now going to have to take it the rest of the journey. And
I can't imagine being in your shoes, because you don't know what it's going to end up as, and I don't.
Well, I can't imagine being in your shoes because you didn't know what you were going to get. It could have been limericks.
That would have been interesting.